grasping our great shields and wearing our hide armor, wheel to wheel hub locked, we battle hand to hand. Our banners darken the sky, the enemy team like clouds. Through the hail of arrows, the warriors press forward. They dash on our lines, they trample our ranks down. The left horse has fallen, the right one is wounded. The wheels are embedded, the foursome entangled. Seize the jade drumstick and beat the sounding drum. The time is against us, the gods are angry. Now all lie ahead on the field of battle. They went out, never more to return. Far, far away they lie on the level plain. Their long swords at their belts, clasping their chin bows. Head from body sundered, but their hearts could not be vanquished. Both truly brave and also truly noble. Strong to the last, they could never be dishonored. Their bodies may have died, but their souls are living. Heroes among the shades, their valiant souls will be. So this is the Striking Eagle by L.K. Chen. It's honestly a really incredible sword. We'll kind of start a little bit with the history, the background of this sword. It was discovered in a tomb by an ancient king around sometime 315 to 221 BC in the ancient kingdom of Chu, which is around the same time period as we look at like the terracotta warriors or the first emperor of China. So there's every possibility that this could have been in the presence of one of those ancient emperors of China. These were most likely used, as far as we can guess, by bodyguards, elite troops, people fighting low armored opponents. And honestly, it's a really incredible sword. So I'll go ahead and pull this up here really quick so you can see it. It looks like, if the light can catch it just right, you have that very subtle snake in the blade, the damascene, the pattern weld, whatever it's called, which historically would have been very, very, very high status. As we look at this guy, you can see, obviously it's different than a lot of the jian that were being used at the time, or the jin. Most of the time, the troops that were carrying jian or these on the battlefield, you'd have a sword of about that length. And this guy is huge. So this is very, very similar length to some of the longest longswords that you'd find in Europe about 1,500 years later than this guy. These are probably the oldest example of two-handed swords in the world. So if you want to look to the first longswords in history, you can look all the way back to the first emperor of China, which is very, very interesting because metallurgically wise, this should not have been possible at the time. But I'll show you some pictures here in a sec. It does look like these were very high status weapons made in steel with a pattern weld, 300 BC. So reading from their website, the Striking Eagle is the longest double-handed jian that they make. This is the sword for the master and appeals to the discerning collectors looking to add one of the longest Chinese swords ever forged in their collection. It's modeled after a 2,000-plus-year-old Chu double-handed sword, excavated during the 1950 to the 1980 from tombs dating back 315 to 221 BC of the ancient kingdom of Chu. They adopted the length of the longest one ever made for this model specifically. This is the Striking Eagle. The blade is light and agile for its extraordinary length and has a subtle mix of flex to absorb impact and rigidity for thrust and strike. A master sword. The hilt has an oval cross-section. Most people believe is accurate to the period because obviously these don't survive. So, getting a close look up at the handle, I'm not a huge fan of these cord bits. And this is the older model. The newer ones, if you look on their website, have a different wrap on the outside, but it has two cord wraps. So on the inside, you have the black cord wrap here with some white twine, this kind of stuff. It is comfortable. These don't hold up very well under stress, based on what other reviewers have said, and I really don't want to test it out too much. Other than that, though, this sword would be pretty much perfect from the perspective of an amateur. As we look up close, you have that bronze cross guard there, which I guess isn't really a cross guard, but has kind of a similar function, maybe to prevent the hand from riding up and down the blade. I don't imagine that this was a particularly strong parrying device at the time. Bronze pommel right there, as you can see, catches the light really beautifully. The finish is almost perfect. You can see we have a little bit of a gap right there at the front of it, right as it joins in there, but that would be looking historical based on what we can see from the originals. couple of criticisms of the sword. Other than the handle, it does appear that as you cut with it, I guess I have this extremely hard water at my house. You can see, hopefully, a little bit of an etch in the blade. So it is a super, super high polish, which is great, but it does stain very easy. So it's going to take a lot of work to push out. Moving on to the scabbard. This is absolutely beautiful. So as we take a look at it, black lacquer on the outside, wood finish on the inside. There's an inside look right there. Absolutely beautiful. It is almost completely flawless. The one that was sent to me, whoop, has a little bit of a ding right there. Not sure what that's from. Could have been light, could have been heavy, I have no idea. Has a pretty interesting bronze thing you can send through a belt. Most typically these were worn through a sash coming across the side, kind of like how you'd imagine a katana would be held. Very similar setup to this guy. Now, I'm obviously not a huge expert on Chinese swords of the period. I have fought with weapons of similar length in temperament and HEMA tournaments. So this guy right here is probably the closest sword that I own to that. So if we ignore this, ignore the crossguard, this is a very similar kind of setup that we see to this sword. Fighting with this, especially in tournament, these tend to be a bit longer than the average sword that you'll find in a HEMA tournament. The blade is the same length. The handle is about 3 inches shorter. So it should fight mostly the same. And even looking at the Siggy, this is the Siggy XL, you can see as I hold it out to length, there's a little bit of a curve that develops as it bends because of the weight in the blade. It is similar to this. You'll see a very, very slight bend. And that's part of the advantage of having a thinner blade, is it moves super fast, but it is a lot more susceptible to impacts and bending. So if I hit this guy in the end, boop, you can see it is super, super, super wiggly, which is fine. I imagine they probably weren't going for super stiff and broad and long. Metallurgically, that I imagine would be pretty hard during the time period. Kind of a similar thing here. Siggy XL fighting thing. I find when I'm fighting with these, typically what I like to do is stand way far out distance and just project the point. So I know when I was fighting at Salt Lake Open 2 years ago, this was the sword that I chose to fight with. It obviously has a ring and more hand protection, but projecting the point out, my favorite was always the Shielhao, where you just Shielhao, cut down the end of their blade and get them right there. I imagine something similar to that would work with a sword like this. I imagine most of the time these swords were used point forward, predominating, acting kind of like a two-handed rapier. Now, some people might disagree with me on that. It can cut. I'll show you some B-roll here in just a sec. But this sword does cut quite well for the length. Some reviewers have mentioned that it does have a hard time getting through more stiff targets, which we know it's not a particularly fat blade, and it's kind of whippy, as we mentioned. If you hit something super stiff, this is obviously going to wiggle. You come around to do a cut, you whip it around kind of weird, it'll bend just a little bit up towards there. The blade will twist slightly, which happens with all swords when you're whipping them around really fast. Swords like this, a little bit more than is typical. Typically, if you want a really good cutting sword with edge alignment that's not going to move a lot, you want a super fat blade and shorter. And that's what I choose to cut with. Other than that, amazing sword, super fun to cut with. Not necessarily what you'd be used to if you're hoping for something like a longsword, but great sword-wise, this is an absolutely incredible piece of equipment right there. It would do well in anyone's sword collection anywhere.